Good evening. Welcome to I Dreamed a World, a celebration of Marita Golden and her 40-year career as a writer, teacher of writing, institution builder, and mentor. I'm Tracy Charles McGee, and I'm joined by Abdul Audi. We're your hosts for this evening for this special event that has been 40 years in the making. While this year may be the 40th anniversary of the publication of Migrations of the Heart, it also marks the beginning of a writing career that has been rewarding for Marita and those who have been inspired by her work. Marita is the author of 22 books, which include fiction and nonfiction, as well as anthologies. She was a guest on the Oprah Winfrey Show and has even been the question on the Jeopardy show. She co-founded the Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Foundation. Her books have been bestsellers, book club favorites, read in colleges and universities, and she's received many honors, including from the Authors Guild and the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. Last year, two of her classics, Saving Our Sons and A Woman's Place, were re-released in new editions, and her most recent book, The Strong Black Woman, won the May Sarton Award for Nonfiction. Marita Golden dreamed a world, and she made it come true. And Marita, you know I'm all about manifestations, and that's exactly what you did. So it is a pleasure and honor to be here to celebrate your exciting career.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Abdul. This really is going to be a celebration not just of me and my writing career, but also of literary friendships. And Tracy and Abdul and I will talk about our connections. But I really want to begin this evening with a toast. And I want to reveal and introduce to everyone out there my husband, Joe Murray, of 32 years. He is my secret weapon. He is my superpower. And the reason I say that is because he believes in me more than I believe in myself. And for those of you in the audience who want to write, who want to be creative, find a life partner, find friends who are the wind beneath your wings. Thank you, Joe.
You're welcome. And to all your writers and readers. Now I got to go. My wife said I got to go.
So we're going to toast. We're going to toast.
First, let's toast.
Celebrations. Everybody's celebrating themselves.
Click.
Thank you, dear.
Sure.
Thank you, Joe.
I'm not going to let my wife drink too much.
Sweetie, I'm drunk on you. So I think it would be really great for everybody to know how we met, because the way in which we met is such a lesson in not just becoming a writer, but in developing a mentorship and developing a friendship. Tracy, you want to start?
Sure. I had one page of a book, and I heard that Marita Golden was going to be teaching, I think a 4 to 6 week class at the local library, Shaw Library.
Martin Luther King.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And I was excited. And so I applied and I took the class, and it was a joyous thing. It was the first time that I was in that setting where I was getting this great feedback from this great teacher and my workshop mates. And well, not always great feedback, just good feedback. And it was the last day, and it was coming to an end, and we were having kind of a celebration, and I was sitting there, and I was like, I do not want this to end. I really would like Marita to be my mentor. How do I ask her? What do I do? And I closed my eyes, and I just said, I want her as my mentor. And then I stared her down, sending this, sending this energy. And then I went up to her and I was about to ask her if she would be my mentor. And she said, would you like to have lunch next week? I was like, oh my God, this manifestation stuff does work. So from there, Marita has just been supportive. She has, read my reading. She was there for my launch. And then we just became friends because we share so many of the same interests, like going to the theater and supporting Black writers. She taught me early on that writing is not just being in front of a computer, laptop, or a piece of paper. It's being out in the world. It's supporting other writers. It's learning your craft. It's reading and just being into literacy development, everything that have to do with that word off the page and on the page. And I've truly tried to embrace that. And I really appreciate the mentorship and friendship that Marita has provided in my life.
And what I love about Tracy is, see, she's very business savvy, and her brain around literature and writing works a little different than mine. So in a mentee relationships, very often the mentor ends up being mentored. And so Tracy and I will be offering for the second time a intensive self-publishing 8-week workshop in the fall. So if anybody's interested in getting information about that, you can log on, go to my website and add your name to my list. But we've learned so much. It's been such a great sharing and interaction. And of course, Abdul was a student at Howard University, the Mecca.
I was a student at Howard University, but our meeting preceded Howard University. I believe you were invited as a guest speaker. It may have been like Black History Month or Women's History Month when I was attending community college.
That's right.
And I remember, it's funny that you said that Joe believes in you more than you believe in you, because what struck me about you was audacity. I think you said, the only one who's writing, the kinds of things I'm writing about is maybe Alice Walker. And I was like, oh my God, who is this woman? I love it. But what struck me was how warm and accessible you were. I think you gave me your business card, and I think I dropped you a line later that day, letting you know what I thought about your presentation, but also about whether someone like me could do this, and I have this photographic memory, and I remember you saying, well, do you know who Anne Frank is? You're never too young to tell your story, and that was the beginning of a wonderful friendship. You watched my daughter grow up. It's just been beautiful, and I'm so grateful for our friendship and your mentorship. And now the circle is turning, we're now mentoring other writers where I was almost 20 years ago. So it's pretty exciting.
And Abdul, I have to share with everyone that you're carrying on the tradition of literary activism by starting the Marita Golden Fellowship, which is a wonderful program that honors annually two students in creative writing at Howard University. And not only are they recognized for their talent, but they get to do internships with major literary organizations, with literary agents. They get mentored by Abdul, by me. They do a public reading. It's an extraordinary opportunity. And I'm so proud that, one, that I was the inspiration, but that you're carrying on the tradition of Hurston Wright. So let's get started. Abdul?
Yeah. So I guess the first question I have, it's related to mentorship. And I would love it if you could tell our audience how mentorship is. It's not a one-way street. Someone finds you in the bathroom and slips you their manuscript. What do you as a mentor get out of that relationship? How is it reciprocal? The mentee is getting something, but also the mentor.
Well, I am a mentor because I was mentored beautifully by some great writers. Audre Lorde called me up one evening when I was living in New York in the early 70s, young, gifted, and Black. And I had given her some of my poems at a bookstore. And I asked her if would she read them. She said, sure. And she called me up, and I was laying on my bed in my little apartment on 92nd Street, and I pick up the phone and it's Audre Lorde telling me that I was a really good writer and to keep writing. June Jordan read some of my work and gave me an enormous amount of encouragement. And I like to tell the story also of having lunch with Toni Morrison. I was writing for Essence magazine, and I was doing one of the first stories on feminism, Black women and feminism. And at that time, Toni had not really become Toni Morrison, but she was on the way there. And we had lunch, and of all the things, all the questions I asked her, I don't remember her answers, but I remember her fierce integrity and her sense of self-possession. I mean, here was a woman who knew who she was. And when you sat across from her, you knew that she knew who she was. And she had given a great deal of thought to being a Black woman in the world. So I was very lucky to be mentored. And also many teachers gave me enormous, and my primary mentors were my parents. My mother, who told me when I was 12 years old that I was going to write a book, and my father, who told me bedtime stories about African and African-American heroes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What would you say to younger people who may be a little shy about approaching someone about mentorship?
Go for it. All they can say is no. And if you have what it takes to get a mentor, and what a mentor is looking for is that you're dedicated. You're halfway there. You know, you've shown that you're going to write. You're going to improve your writing, so that it's really going to be a partnership. So that if you're doing the work and you're serious about it, finding a mentor should not be that hard.
Mm-hmm. Now, is there any etiquette that you would recommend? Because, I know some folks can be very aggressive, giving you the shakedown at a book signing, slipping you their
you don't. Well, I've had people ask me, will you mentor me? And I can either say yes or no.
Oh, wow. That's direct. Okay. Pivoting a little bit, I know that Tracy mentioned your illustrious 40-year career, 22 books of fiction and nonfiction. But I wanted to ask you about the anthologies. You are a noted anthologist, and a lot of folks don't talk about, the importance of anthologies. And I would love it if you could share your interest in anthologies and your larger vision that informs you editing 4 or 5 anthologies. And I'm very proud to be included in one of them.
Well, Terry McMillan edited Breaking Ice, which was a seminal anthology of the late 80s, early 90s, and kind of reintroduced so many writers who were part of that sort of late 80s, 90s renaissance. And it had an enormous impact. And when I did with Elin Harris, the anthology Gumbo, that was a fundraising effort for the foundation, the Hurston Wright Foundation. But also it's a great vehicle for just introducing writers. Every writer's not going to have their own book, but people who love writing love anthologies because, as Elin Harris said, it's like a big box of chocolates. Each night you can pick a different story to read. And I did an anthology of writing about Alzheimer's disease after I spent several years writing about that. So I think anthologies are great. I don't know that they're as popular as they used to be, but they have been very important in introducing a lot of writers to their audiences.
Yes,
And
I might add that we just celebrated the 20th anniversary of the anthology Gumbo, which you just spoke of, that you did with Elin Harris.
Yeah, and so many of the writers went on.
That's right, and we were able to bring some of them together at a Hurston Wright event.
And I want to do this though. I want to start out. Because we're here to the start of this is really the 40th anniversary of the publication of Migrations of the Heart, my first book, which I had no idea that it was going to be that it was going to be a memoir. I'd written a novel and went to the woman who's been my agent for 40 years, which is extraordinary to have an agent that long. And she said, this is great, but why aren't you writing about living in Nigeria as an African American woman married into an African family? And I said, I don't know. And then when I went back to Nigeria and that life fell apart, I said, oh my God, this is a story. And the first two paragraphs of Migrations of the Heart are, in some ways, I think the most important writing I've done, because those paragraphs launched my career, and it took me so long to figure out how to start this book. And yet, once I had figured out what to do, it made perfect sense that I would start with my father, who told me stories about Africa, and that I would then go into a young woman who felt enormous pride in herself and who married an African and lived in Africa. So these are the first two sentences, and I love them. And it took a lot of writing and a lot of thinking to figure out how to do this, but I think it was well worth it, and I'm proud of it. My
Let's
father was
hear
the
it.
first man I ever loved. He was as assured as a panther. His ebony skin was soft as the surface of cold. The vigorous scent of El Producto cigars was a perfume that clung to him. The worn leather seat of his taxi, a stubborn aroma, had seeped into his pores, and like a baptism, the smells rubbed onto me from the palms of his hands. In school, he went as far as the sixth grade, then learned the rest on his own. Part of the rest he bequeathed to me, gold nuggets of fact, myth, legend, dropped in the lap of my mind, shiny new pennies meant to be saved. By his own definition, he was a Black man and proud of it. Arming me with a measure of this conviction, he unfolded a richly colored tapestry, savored its silken texture, and warned me never to forget its worth. And I remember, oh God, how do I start this book? How do I start this book? And the lesson there is to just stay with the story. The story will tell you how to tell it.
Wow. And so what was the challenge for starting your career with a memoir?
Um, I was writing at a time when memoirs were not as popular as they are now. The memoir, I like to think, is a product of the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, because it legitimized voices of women and people of color, people on the margins, who had been not given a center place in the literary establishment or the literary imagination. And so the challenge was, before anybody even knows me, I'm telling them my life story. Who's going to be interested in reading about Marita? I haven't been to the moon. I'm not a millionaire. Why does anyone want to read about me? Well, they wanted to read about me because I learned to use language beautifully to tell an ordinary story of a little girl growing up and going out into the world.
That almost read, I mean, basically read like a novel.
Yes, that's a good point, because I tricked myself as I was writing into pretending that I was writing a novel, because I was so afraid of sharing intimate details of my life. I said, I'm writing a novel about this woman named Marita Golden. I know everything about her. This is not a memoir, but I wrote it like a novel. And I do think that I love to teach courses with people who are writing fiction and nonfiction, because the memoirist has to have the ability to create a whole world, to dream a world. And the fiction writer has to have that sense of confession and telling and revealing that the memoirist has.
And as we were saying, you've written these novels, you've written nonfiction. Is there a character in your novels that you most relate to?
In a sense, all of my characters are a little bit of me.
Composite.
I mean, for example,
Others.
I remember meeting John Steptoe, the great African American illustrator of children's books and artist, and he said that every face that he paints is his own. In some way, every face has some aspect of how he looks. And so many of the female characters in my books are dialoguing with some aspect of my personality or character, or I'm having them do things that I wish I could do, that I was brave enough to do. Um, I want to share another 2-paragraph section from one of my novels, Long Distance Life, that was inspired by the life of my mother, Beatrice Lee Reed Golden. Um, Long Distance Life is a story of 60 years of the life of a Black family in Washington, D.C. And it was inspired by my mother's migration from Greensboro, North Carolina to Washington. And when I was writing the book, I really felt myself in communication with her. I felt to some extent myself channeling her. And in the book, I decided that I was going to give her alter ego a wonderful husband, a lover, a husband who was much sweeter to her than my dad was to my mom. So I gave her this wonderful love affair. And as I was writing, because it takes place in the 20s, and they meet at a rent party, which those of you are familiar with rent party know back in the day, our folks would give a big party and they sell chitlins, collard greens, all that stuff per plate, and they'd raise the money to pay the rent. And so this is a little 2-paragraph section where Naomi Johnson has met this man, the man she's going to marry, Rayford Johnson. And I had a lot of fun writing this, and I really felt it was my mother talking through me. She says, I felt pretty good, because she's met him at this rent party that she gave. I felt pretty good. Had a sweetheart and no more empty bed blues. And serious as he was, Rayford Johnson knew how to please a woman. Some mornings I'd get out of bed when we'd been together and feel like I could tear up the house and put it back together again. He wasn't making no whole lot of money as a teacher, but he never asked me for a dime. He had an old Ford somebody gave him. And when we went out, we went in his car, not mine. He had pride, and I think that's what won my heart more than anything else. Well, we've been going together almost a year, and I knew what I wanted. So one night he came to see me. He could have took one look at that meal and knew I meant business. We listened to some Louis Armstrong records he brought over, and then we got into bed. Oh, he fixed me real good that night. And afterwards, we're laying there, him smoking them Chesterfield cigarettes he'd been smoking, he once told me, since he was 16. And I'm feeling all soft and warm and happy. And I just asked him, just like that, to marry me. I had never seen a man blush before, but Rayford laid there looking like what I'd said had made his day. Well, when he got himself composed, he says, you don't leave nothing to chance, do you, Miss Naomi Reeves? And I told him, only way I'm going to get what I want is to ask for it. I always figure on hearing yes. And no don't scare me, because I heard no all my life. It ain't never stopped me yet. But smart as you are, I knew you'd have sense enough to say yes. And that was my mother. That was
Love it.
So, and there's a whole other story about how Rayford Johnson teaches at Dunbar back in the 30s. And a year later, I met Joe Murray, who also taught at Dunbar. But that's a whole other story about witchcraft and
Yes.
Manifesting. Manifesting.
yes.
I had a question for you, Marita. One of the things that I love about your body of work is that you keep coming back home to Washington, Black Washington, giving us a sense of legacy. And I wanted to know, do you consider yourself to be a regional writer, a Washington writer? I know that, academics love to label writers, but I'm interested to know, how do you see yourself, and why is Washington so much a big part of your body of work?
Oh, yes, I definitely see myself as a Washington writer, a national writer, a world writer. But
All
there's a whole world of Black life in Washington, D.C. that has been generally ignored by the larger literary world. But for example, even people like Gene Toomer, in his beautiful collection of short stories and meditations, Cane, he dove into the Washington, D.C. of the 1920s and the 1930s. And so it was very important for me to bring the Washington that is not part of Capitol Hill, that is not the politicians, that is the neighborhoods. I mean, and for example, a writer like Edward P. Jones, there are many of us who have taken our writing as a way to portray the grandeur and the majesty of ordinary lives lived behind the White House, behind Capitol Hill. So I'm proud to say that I am a Washington writer.
All right. Well, shifting gears just a little bit because I want to talk a little bit more about your activism. You and Clyde McIlveen founded the Hurston Wright Foundation over 30 years ago, and I did have the honor to work for this organization for a period of time. The mission has remained the same to discover, mentor, and honor Black writers. But what do you see, or if you see that the challenges have changed at all for Black writers over the course of 30 years? Are the same types of supports still needed, or has there been a shift? And you know, many of your books, they talk about social justice issues. What shifts in social justice issues have you seen over the course of 30 plus years since you founded that organization?
Well, the publishing industry, there was an article that was done about 30 years ago in the Village Voice. It was called The Unbearable Whiteness of Whiteness. And it was about the publishing industry. Mm-hmm. And that article could pretty much still be written today, despite the really significant changes that have taken place. I mean, and organizations like the Hurston Wright Foundation, Cave Canem, VONA, Cambelia, all these organizations that support and mentor Black writers have not only mentored a whole, probably 2 generations of Black voices, but by the brilliance that these organizations have revealed, has forced the publishing industry to open avenues for these voices to be heard, for these voices to be published. Yet at the same time, the industry remains a very closeted, cliquish industry where, as Walter Mosley recently said in an interview in the New York Times, you hire your friends who also went to Barnard or Sarah Lawrence with you, or to Harvard or Yale with you, who grew up in Westchester with you. And we're still dealing with issues of affirmative action and diversity and equity after all these years. The issues of having a diverse pool of editors. We should now, for example, at this point in the industry, have editors, Black editors who've been in the industry for 30 years or 40 years. But too often we're looking at, whenever the industry downsizes, writers and editors of color are the first to go. So the issues to some extent are the same. At the same time, we cannot deny the real progress in terms of publishing Black voices that has taken place. And now is a very interesting and somewhat dangerous time because of the increase in book banning, the increased racial polarization being fanned by politicians, social media, which from the right and the left shuts down a lot of voices. I mean, I was at an event just last night and talking to a brilliant young Black woman who's in tech and startup. And she was talking about her life, all these things she'd done. I said, well, you need to be writing about this. You need to be blogging. And she said, well, I was blogging, but I got cyberbullied. I was cyberbullied so relentlessly that I just stopped. So that writers are facing, problems getting published, and it is much more difficult to get published now than it was 5 or 6 years ago. I don't care about the 30 seconds after George Floyd died, where it seemed that the publishing industry was going to change. Really, it hadn't. And I told her, I said, well, don't be bullied. You know, take your story and make it into a little book. You know, you can ban a book, but you can't ban the ideas in a book. You can't bully a book. So find another way to get your ideas out there. So we're facing the same issues of Black voices, Black people with the power. Now we do have, for example, a Black woman is the president, I think, of Simon and Schuster. And I know over at Pantheon, we have an African American woman. But look, it's the 21st century. Okay. Why did it take this long? So there's still a lot of work to do. And in this deeply polarized, deeply fearful time, the work that we're doing as writers, Black writers, has never been more important. Never been more important.
This is true.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Abdul.
I wanted to quickly ask, which is related to what you just mentioned, where did the idea of becoming a literary activist, a literary citizen come from, when you were starting out? Because, for all the years that I've known you, I know you to be an organizer of people intergenerationally of all differences. And, you started the African American Writers Guild before the Hearst Wright Foundation. Like, you've always been kind of like at the center of organizing us to think about the larger questions, the larger issues in our community. So it's like you have this brilliant career on and off the page. And I just wanted to know where did that model or inspiration come from?
Well, I was in college in the 60s and I was an activist. I was very active in the Black Student Union. I worked with Pride, the organization that the former mayor of Washington, D.C., Marion Barry, had started working with job training. And the 60s sparked something in me. I think that community, connecting people with opportunity, connecting people one with the another is in my DNA. So that's a natural for me. Also, I'll be very honest, the literary activism came from loneliness. I didn't want to be, once I realized that this writing thing was serious, that it wasn't, that I was really in it, I knew that I had to have a community. I mean, I knew that I'm the kind of writer, I had to have a community. And I was living in Boston at the time and not loving it, in fact, hating it. Most Black people who've been to Boston can understand why. And as I was thinking about where I wanted to go next, I thought of coming back to my hometown of Washington, D.C. And as soon as I got back here, I worked with Clyde McIlvaine, who heard me on a radio station being interviewed by Diane Rehm about Migration of the Heart. And we started the African American Writers Guild. And it was basically a selfish desire to be in community with Black writers. And I knew that if I had that desire and that need, a lot of other Black writers did too. And Clyde said a very important thing to me when we were working on developing Hearst and Wright. He said, Marita, you have to understand, we're not just offering workshops, we're building an institution.
Absolutely. And the same, we can talk about the fact that you were a professor for many years, but you now convene mainly women in these workshops. Have those stories, were any of those stories one of the reasons why you felt an urgency to write The Strong Black Woman? What informed that? What made you really decide this is a book that needs to be written now?
The Strong Black Woman, How a Myth Endangers the Physical and Mental Health of Black Women. Once again, so much of what activates us in the world is personal. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because our personal needs and desires and experiences mirror everyone else's. And I had no idea, no plans to write that book until I had kind of a little episode where I felt like I was having a stroke, and I wasn't. Got through the weekend, went to the emergency room. They said, "You're fine, but go to your doctor and see why this happened." Went to my doctor, and he said, "Look, let's get an MRI." And had an MRI, and it revealed that I'd had sometime in the past 2 silent strokes. That is, strokes that occur that kill brain cells, but that you have no awareness of, no knowledge that you had the stroke. So that was really the impetus for writing The Strong Black Woman, because it warred with my concept of myself as a strong Black woman. I mean, we always have that vision, Black women, that we're capable. And I had constructed this image. I mean, I've got it going on. I mean, my mother died when I was 22. My father died when I was 23. I looked at their early deaths and said, I'm not going out like that. I'm going to live a long time. Did everything right. Exercise, great diet, meditate, friendships, married the right man. And you're telling me I've had 2 silent strokes? So I went home really kind of depressed. And it took me a while to understand that because I had lived a life dedicated to militant health practices, that's why those strokes were silent. Because a stroke killed my mother and a heart attack killed my father. So my body actually was not warring against me, but it was acting in a way that was the result of being healthy. And then I went on the internet and saw this whole conversation going on about Black women wanting to dismantle the strong Black woman ideology because of how dangerous it was. And so we were in the middle of the pandemic, and oh my God, I've got another story. But I think that part of your question also is, you alluded to my workshops. I do writing workshops, and this is not purposeful, but they end up being mostly women. I'll have, a man occasionally, but we're in this really crazy place now where even in the midst of the banning of books, even with the change, with how difficult it is to get published, people these days really feel that they have the right to tell their story. And they don't just want to tell their story, they want to write their story. And these are often women who are maybe early 50s, retired, and they have absolutely amazing stories. And they also are very, very talented writers. These are women who probably a decade ago would never think of writing their life story. But now they're in a world that says, yes, you can. And I get the opportunity to work with them. And many of them are brilliant and very, very fine writers. So the image of the really great writer as a young person in their 20s or 30s is not the standard anymore. It's anybody who wants to tell their story and is willing to do the work.
Absolutely.
Speaking as a literary activist, what are some new frontiers? What is, I don't know, what am I asking? I wanted to know, what do you see as the work that still needs to be done?
Well, I'd like to see us developing more Black critics, writing for Black literary magazines. I'd like to see more Black publishing companies. I mean, I think it's very nice when a publishing house will give a Black writer an imprint. That's great. And most of it, and pretty much all the time, these writers will use that imprint to publish writers that only they can connect with. So I think that's a powerful tool. But I think it's even more powerful for us to develop our own publishing companies, and that's something that I would really like to see as the next frontier.
What about developing audiences? Because, there's so many things competing with the book. Like I often worry that the day may come where just writers are reading other writers, I don't know.
I don't think that's ever going to happen. Look at what's on Netflix. Half of it came from a book.
Mhm.
Look at what's in the movies. Half of it came from a book. Now, the writers generally don't get nearly as much attention. For example, you take Queen Sugar, the very successful series that was on the Oprah Winfrey Network. That was written by Natalie Bezell, who is a writer that the Hurston Wright Foundation recognized when she was a college writer. The book then, which was changed radically, but it became the foundation of a wildly successful series. So I never worry about the demise of the book or people not reading books. That's the last thing I worry about. We will, of course, books can exist beside the internet. Books can exist beside AI. We're a long way from getting rid of the book.
Okay. Should we go and see if we have any comments?
Yes.
If there are questions that you have for Marita, I have like a long list here. I'm getting kind of lost in my list, so I would love to hear from those that are tuning in if you have any questions.
Well, I'd like to, while we're trying to figure that out. Oh, here's Kwame. Oh, the great Kwame Alexander.
Okay, should I go ahead and read
Yeah,
this?
yeah, sure.
Okay, so we've seen this is Kwame Alexander. Hey, Kwame. We've seen a lot of this progress before. When we think of the poets and writers published during the Harlem Renaissance, the upswing in novels published during the 90s, how do we avoid this time now becoming just a trend that we look back on, shaking our head?
Oh, I didn't know the president of Simon and Schuster stepped down. Oh my God. Yeah,
And
and
Lisa
I think
Lucas is still a pantheon.
yeah, for the moment, yeah, and I think this is where many of our Black philanthropists and billionaires, for example, the Black billionaire. I mean, and it doesn't take $1 billion. It doesn't take $1 billion to develop a publishing company. Akashic Publishers, which is run by a wonderful fan of Black writing. I think his name is Johnny Miller. He is single-handedly responsible for publishing a good portion of the best literary fiction by Black writers and Black writers from the diaspora that is being published today. He's not a millionaire. He's not a billionaire. And I think that it's something that we just have to decide we're going to do. It's not rocket science. It's just deciding that we're going to have. I mean, hats off to Third World Press, which celebrated 50 years. Red Sea Press, but we need to have a whole blooming of publishing options and opportunities that are owned and run by Black people.
Absolutely, Marita.
Harriet, she says, what are your views about self-publishing? This seems to be something that many are doing. I'll throw this to you in a second, Tracy, but I do want to say that it's very interesting. We're now in a place where the legacy publishing companies, Random House, Simon and Schuster, are shrinking. They are publishing fewer and fewer writers. And what they've done is they've looked at the proliferation of so many really talented writers and said, okay, we can't publish everybody for a variety of reasons. We don't even want to publish everybody. But so what we will do is we'll reject so many people. And in that space, you will have independent self-publishing as a viable option. So we now have two publishing worlds, the legacy publishers and the self-publishing independent industry, which is viable and legitimate And I don't see anything wrong with it. Tracy, talk about your experience, because I think you're the blueprint for how to successfully do that. Talk about your book.
Well, I don't want to totally talk about my book, but I want to talk about the books of many people that have self-published. You can really do this with support, with resources, and tools, and you can put out a quality book. Whether or not you self-publish or go with a traditional publisher, you're going to have to treat your author life as an entrepreneur, as a business. And so you're going to have to learn marketing tools. You're going to have to build your platform, and you're going to have the courage to put yourself out there. And again, that's something that is valuable, whether or not you have the support of a publisher or if you're publishing the book yourself. So
Right.
if you have that story, you have that book that you want to birth, there are a lot of options for you now. And so, yes, self-publishing is definitely a viable option.
And Tracy won't say it, so I'll say it. She's a consultant who works with people who want to self-publish. And she's going, and one of the things that we're going to talk about in our self-publishing intensive later on this year is how to create a quality manuscript. I mean, the days when back in the 90s, you would have these writers conferences when everybody wanted to be the next Terry McMillan. And people would brag, yeah, I wrote my novel over the weekend. I wrote my novel in 30 days. Nobody does that anymore. Nobody does that anymore. So that we're talking about self-publishing books being well-written books. And what we can just say is it's a viable option, and it can be done.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed. Looking through.
Jean?
Okay, so yes, okay. What opportunities for intersectional writing and or collaboration with other writers of color are not being explored by the writing community at large, or with publishers?
I think this is something that all of us can probably, respond to, because we're all sort of in the industry. Well, the industry puts everybody in a box. Black writers, quote, Hispanic writers, and every group. White writers always remain in style, but the rest of us will get a time when we're flavor of the month. And I think that's a great question, because I really would like to see more writers just of all races and working together.
Right.
I mean, I'm thinking now like an anthology of writers of LGBT, Native American, Mexican, just a blow it out of the water anthology. This is what America looks like. Okay. And if just thinking of this, for example, I recently discovered that the great Native American poet Joy Harjo is a musician as well as a great poet. And I went online and accessed some of her work, and now in love with Joy Harjo. And I was familiar with her work, but oh my God, is she ever brilliant? Is she ever bad? And I think what I love about that question is it says, why are we all in these silos? Black writers, Hispanic writers. We need to just be writers. And I would love to see more opportunities for us to come together, work together, write together. Do you guys
Yes.
want to say anything about that?
And we have these tools and social media come together for discussions,
Yeah.
and bringing people together in groups. We have to, like you said, leave our little bubbles, our little circles, and spread the love, and also, find ways to have solutions about the issues that we're having, bringing different perspectives.
Yeah, definitely.
I guess what I would say is, I guess an experiment with that might be some of the community workshops that have really proliferated. It used to be that if you're interested in being a serious writer, you go to the Iowa workshop or something else. But I think that there's just a versioning of all kinds of writer communities,
Mhm.
but are they diverse in the way that you described it, Marita? I don't know. I feel like it's getting maybe more segregated.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
every identity, there's a workshop for. But
Yes.
can I just be who I am and in community with other writers? You can, but I think the pandemic has realized that we still have a long way to go. People are going to a lot of these mostly white establishment spaces, and there's a lot of issues that still need to be resolved. So it makes me sad to think that these things are hard to come by. So maybe
Yeah.
we need to make them, create them, like you've done, Marita, inviting folks into your home and creating workshops and being that agency that you want to see.
Yeah. Yeah. Toni Morrison. I mean, one of the reasons, in fact, my best-selling book of all time is the anthology "Wild Women Don't Wear No Blues: Black Women Writers on Love, Men, and Sex."
Oh,
Sold about 70,000 copies, and
ooh.
for a mid-list writer, is pretty good. And I wrote that book because when back in the 80s and 90s, there was a proliferation of relationship books. How to have a good relationship, blah blah blah. And I never saw any books that were from the perspective of Black women. And so I said, well, I need to write this book so I can find it in the bookstore. And Toni Morrison said, that's what you do.
Hmm.
That's right. Absolutely. Zora's Dan, do you think self published authors' books will ever reach the same level of respect in the literary world as the traditionally published authors' books?
I mean, I don't know about that. All I can say is that there are awards for independently self-published books that honor really well-written, independently published, self-published books. And the publishing industry is always on the prowl looking for self-published books that not only have sold very well because of the work of the author, but that are well written. And they know that there are really well written books out there now. I mean, for example, the Washington Post reviews self published books. Ron Charles, one of the best reviews, they review self published books. Self published books are in the bookstore, self published books are in the library. So I think in time, any remaining stigma will be dispelled.
And and
There's just too much.
frankly,
There's just too much good writing being
quite frankly, we
self-published.
need to make a shift from being concerned about the level of respect,
I
because
agree.
we want to think about whose respect are we talking about.
I agree.
Um, we just want to have the ability to expose the level of exposure, the level of distribution. Some of those things we can control and work on
Yes.
ourselves. So it's
Yes.
not always about the level of respect, but how
Yes.
can we get these book out
Yeah. As a
through our
stable
own
singer,
efforts and getting hmm
as a stable singer said, respect yourself.
exactly
And also, nothing succeeds like success. So,
Yes.
right.
if your book is selling, like, you have to respect that.
I mean,
That's
the
right.
Legacy Award, which is recognized excellence in Black writers, opened up so many opportunities for Black writers. And for example, as an example of its power, many years ago, one of the writers won an award, and at that time, her publishers had not decided whether or not they were going to bring it out in paperback. Well, the day after she won the Legacy Award, they said it goes into paperback. So we can create our own respect.
RESPECT, find out what us,
Exactly.
right? Um,
Exactly.
Hi, Angela, African American Writers Guild. Love. Okay.
Yeah, back in the day.
And Brian, he wants to know, how do you balance your writing time and your personal life?
Well, I've always been like a super organized person. And when I was younger, in the early days of my writing career, I would get up very early. I'd get up, say, around 4 or 5, and I would do yoga, meditate, and then I'd write for an hour. And then I'd go to my job at in public television in New York. And I felt very satisfied because I'd done the most important thing to me. The most important thing to me every day was to write something. And so I'm of the school that God gave us 24 hours a day. And so that if you really want to write, you can write. There is enough time. You will have to restructure your life, but it is entirely possible. I also think that, many times male writers, and I find male writers particularly will say this, oh, I write 12 hours a day. Oh, I write 6 hours. Right. Okay. Yeah. Right. You got no kids. You're not responsible for changing diapers or shopping. And so the brilliant thing about women writers is that we can write, we can write an hour a day and still do as much as you do in 6 hours. So the time is there. The time is there.
Mm.
We have time for like one or two more questions.
Um,
Yeah, exactly.
that's right,
Kwame, who
Kwame.
cares? Who cares whether the literary world respects them? Exactly. And that's what organizations like Kaveh Khanum and Hurston Wright and all these greats are about, respecting ourselves and building those publishing companies.
So, Marita, this has been a really wonderful celebration to go over so many of the awesome things that you've done over the course of 40 years. And I know you're still working on good stuff. So what are you working on now? What's
Well,
next?
yeah, in next month, March, I have a workshop coming up called How to Tell a Story. And it's a workshop for fiction writers, nonfiction writers, 2 3-hour sessions about how to tell a story. Because no matter what the story is that you're writing, whether it's an op-ed, an editorial, a letter, a poem, a story, a memoir, there has to be drama, there has to be tension, there has to be mystery. And so in that workshop, I'll be talking about the basic elements of what makes a really good story. Also in May, I will be publishing, my publisher will be bringing out a follow-up to The Strong Black Woman called The New Black Woman. Loves herself, has boundaries, heals every day. And when I did The Strong Black Woman, many people asked me, well, this is a great book, but what do you do? What are your practices for maintaining balance, emotional balance, and setting boundaries? So it's a little book in which I share some of my secrets, my wisdom. And in May, I'll be having a 2-session workshop on the business of publishing. And I'm really excited about this because I'm going to have a literary agent and an editor as part of that workshop. So all this information is on my website, but if you want to make sure that you can get that information, sign up to join my email list through my website. But I've really enjoyed sharing this evening with you guys, as well as so many people that were in the audience. I mean, we had a really, really great registration for this, and people like my old friend Patrice Gaines and Tina McElroy Ansa. We're old chicks from the 80s and 90s who grew up writing back in those days, and we're still out here writing. We're still doing the do. So this has been a lot of fun, a great celebration.
Yes.
And we absolutely thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being Marita. And thank you for all that you've given us with your books, with your activism, and with your personality, with your cheerful personality that often provides inspiration to us all to keep going, to keep writing.
Well, I'm going to end by answering a question that Abdul did not ask me, but that when we were forming this, we talked about. And he said, what would you tell your younger self, your younger Marita? And I would tell her 2 things. I tell her, In the words of the great philosopher Bobby McFerrin, don't worry, be happy. And then I would tell her, based on 40 years of trying to be human and trying to be sane, gratefully accept and expect your heart's desires, provided by the limitless possibilities of the universe. Clear your mind and let God guide your actions, your attitudes, and your outcomes. That's what I tell her.